Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody that are here today with us in this seminar of the group of cognitive processing and development. Thank you very much for attending to all the activities that we have in the group. And today we have a very special occasion, receiving today with a great honor to Michelle Donsala, that is here with us to talk to us about her work. So let me introduce a little bit about the dynamic of the talk today. As you know, we are going live, so you are going to have a link where you can ask all your questions. It's going to be there. Please participate in this dynamic, please. We are going to have a very nice talk today, so ask all your questions. And I want to present our guest today. For me, it's a great honor to have her today here. So I'm going to read a little bit about her career. So Michelle Donsala recently graduated from the University of Amsterdam, where she completed a research master's in psychology with a specialization in methodology and statistics with cum laude. And I want to say the title of her thesis, The Moore Flanker and the Brightness Illusion Test, two new tests to assess inhibition. Also, she obtained her BS from the University of Zurich in major in psychology and a minor in business administration. Along her studies, Michelle worked as a research assistant at the Chair of Social and Business Psychology at the University of Zurich and at the Psychological Method Unit of the University of Amsterdam. Currently, she works at a statistical office of the Canton of Zurich as a data science intern, and she will start a PhD position in the fall. Michelle has a strong interest in cognitive modeling and mathematical psychology, and for me, it's a great honor to have her today here as part of this cognitive family. So, Michelle, thank you very much for this great opportunity. The stage is all yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, for the very kind introduction. And it's an honor to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to presenting my work. And I'm also looking forward to the discussion and questions afterwards. The title of my talk is Creative or Not, Hierarchical Diffusion Modeling of the Creative Evaluation Process. And the project I'm presenting today is joint work with Julia Haave and Claire Stevenson from the University of Amsterdam. And we just recently published a preprint about the project I'm presenting today. So if afterwards you want to know more about it or read something in detail, you're very welcome to check it out. So I would like to start my talk by talking a bit about the role of creativity. Creativity is very important for our society to be successful. We needed to develop business ideas, to create awe-inspiring art, and also to conduct groundbreaking research. According to the standard definition of creativity, a creative idea is both original and useful. A novel and very innovative idea that is impossible to implement is not considered creative. And likewise, an idea that is very useful, but that is not novel, for example, because somebody has already thought of the idea or the product before, that's also not considered creative. Now, when it comes to assessing creativity, practitioners and researchers often use divergent thinking tasks, such as the alternative uses task. In this task, people need to come up with as many uses as possible for a particular object. For example, for the object book. And the idea then is that participants type or write down as many responses as they can think of. For example, you could use a book as a paperweight. You could learn how to read. You could use it to learn how to read. You could use it to send a secret message to someone. But of course, there are many other possibilities. And afterwards, those responses are rated usually by independent raters, that they score them in terms of originality and utility. And often also fluency is computed, so how many solutions a person has produced. Now, divergent thinking can be seen as a process that encompasses two main phases, ideation and evaluation. Ideation is like a brainstorm phase where you try to come up with as many ideas as possible. So for the researcher, this could be different research ideas. For a painter, these could be sketches. And for a startup, new innovative business ideas. And then the evaluation phase is where you decide whether you want to pursue something or whether you discard the idea. And it's important to remember that usually it only takes one well-selected idea to solve a problem. So you don't need all the ideas that you came up with. And we can think of these two processes as encompassing memory search and decision making. And we can use them, we can study them using mathematical models. And research so far has mostly looked at the ideation phase, and very little is known about the evaluation phase. And so that's the focus today. Previous research has mainly focused on population level effects and found that people seem to value originality more than utility on average. But there could also be, it also seems plausible that there are individual differences and that people differ in how much they value those two dimensions. For example, some people may consider originality more important than others. And we will call that quantitative individual differences. But it could also be the case that some people completely ignore either of the two dimensions. For example, some people may not take utility into account at all when they decide whether they find something creative or not. And so this evaluation phase of divergent thinking is largely unexplored. We don't really know much about the cognitive underpinnings of it. And so in this project, we had two main goals. We wanted to better understand how people judge whether something is creative or not, and which cognitive processes play a role when judging creativity. And we wanted to examine whether and how people differ in their implicit values of originality and utility. Now, to examine the evaluation phase of the AUT, and also to explore individual differences in the two creativity dimensions, originality and utility, we use the creative or not task. That's a timed two-choice decision-making task where participants are asked to decide whether a use for a certain object, for example, the object book, is creative or not. So here the use would be send secret messages. And in the task, there are 64 stimuli, and they vary on the dimensions originality and utility. So some stimuli are more original than others, and some are more useful than others. Now, to address the questions we had, and so to better understand the evaluation process and to explore the individual differences, we decided to model contask data using the drift diffusion model. The drift diffusion model is a cognitive process model that is often applied to time two-choice decision-making tasks. And I'm now quickly going to explain the model's assumptions applied to the contask. So the model sees the response process in the contask as kind of an interaction between different unobserved cognitive processes. And each of these is represented by a parameter. So first, the parameter beta is like an a priori bias towards either of the two response options. And so, for example, if the bias is high up here, then the person is a priori more likely to respond with yes, creative. And then the drift rate parameter delta here is kind of like the tendency to respond creative. And the higher the absolute value of the drift rate, the faster the response, and also the more evidence there is for a response for either of the response options. And so the idea is that when faced with a contask stimuli, the participant accumulates information over time, and as soon as either of the two boundaries is reached, so either yes, creative, or no, not creative, the decision process is complete. And so in this case here, at that point, the person would decide yes, creative, for a certain stimuli. And then the third parameter that we have is the boundary separation parameter alpha. And this represents response caution. So if people respond more cautiously, they take more time, alpha is high. And you can also see that, so basically this vertical distance is determined by alpha. So if alpha is high, the distance between the two boundaries is bigger. And then the fourth parameter here is the non-decision time parameter, tau. And this aims to capture processes that do not involve the actual decision-making. So this could be motor control or stimulus encoding. Those are the four parameters. We decided to use this model on the one hand, because it's really nice that it allows researchers to disentangle those different processes. But also, we wanted to explore the role of decision speed in the contask, because that's actually a very nice property. The diffusion model takes into account both, so the decisions and the decision speed. And we thought so there's not really much known about how decision speed is involved in the evaluation phase. And so, for example, it could be that a highly original stimulus could be easier to judge as creative or not, because it might be more clearly creative to some people, for example. So, and then the assumption would be that a decision is made faster. So, but these were just some things we thought could be the case. And to explore that in more in depth, we chose this model. Okay, so I'm now going to explain how we approach the modeling. So we estimated the model in a Bayesian hierarchical framework. This allowed us to explore the data both at the individual level, so we could examine how people differed, but also at the population level, so we could see on average how does our sample behave. And then another advantage of Bayesian hierarchical modeling is that it allows a more conservative estimation of the extent to which people differ, because it shrinks the individual estimates towards the population mean. And so in general, the main focus was on the drift rate parameter. So out of the four I introduced earlier, the drift rate parameter was the one we paid most attention to, because it reflects the tendency. We saw it as reflecting the tendency to respond creative. And that's also why we decided to put it at the center of the model, kind of. And that's now the part of the model I'm going to explain more detail. So what we did is we regressed the drift rate parameter onto the stimulus originality and utility ratings. And so what we have here is we have like a regression with an originality effect on the drift rate and a utility effect on the drift rate. And since we have a hierarchical model here, we also incorporated individual level effects. So the I represents participants. So we have a drift rate for participant I and trial J. And then we have an intercept, an originality effect, and a utility effect for each participant. And because we noticed that there were also considerable item effects, so some stimuli in the contask were answered much more slowly than others, we thought it would be a good idea to also include stimulus effects. That's represented by this term here and the J. So we applied the hierarchical DDM to two studies, or two samples, but with different objectives. Study 1 was exploratory. Here we really estimated the model for the first time, and we tried out different parameterizations and checked what worked and what didn't. And we also used non-informative priors for that purpose. And then in study 2, the goal was to see whether we could basically replicate the findings from study 1, whether we would find the same thing. And what we did was we pre-registered our model, the whole analyses, and then conducted confirmatory Bayesian hypothesis testing. And those hypotheses were informed by study 1 and by previous research. And given the nature of this study, we used more informative priors also for the hypothesis tests. Now, the two studies followed the same procedures. So first, participants completed the alternative uses task. So this is the task where they need to come up with as many uses for an object. And afterwards, they completed the con task. And in the end, they were also asked to explicitly rate to what extent they thought that originality and utility are more important for creativity. And actually, it was not just originality and utility, but also innovativeness and appropriateness, because those are often used as a synonym for originality and utility. Yes, so those were self-report measures. And I'm now going to present the results of both studies at the same time so that we can also compare them more easily. So let's have a look at the results of the studies. So here you see visualizations of the data before the modeling. And the upper row indicates, so the upper row is from study 1 and the lower is from study 2. And what we see here is on the left, each dot represents a stimulus. So here we have response times and stimulus originality and stimulus utility. And what we observed was a small tendency for highly original and highly useful stimuli to be answered more slowly. But as you can see, there are also some item effects. So some stimuli were answered more slowly than others. And interestingly, we found the same pattern in study 2. And then on the right, we have the distribution of response times across participants for not creative responses and for creative responses. And what we see is that actually the response times are pretty similar across the two response types. And also, again, in comparison with study 2. The average response time was a bit smaller in study 2 than in study 1. But apart from that, the patterns were similar. So after inspecting and cleaning the data, we estimated the drift diffusion model and assessed the model fit using posterior predictive checks. And the model was actually could reproduce the general patterns in the data pretty nicely. So we deemed it a good fit. On average, there was no bias, no a priori bias towards either of the response options. And with regard to the boundary separation parameter, that's another thing worth mentioning, is that it was a bit higher than what's commonly found in drift diffusion model applications, but that's likely due to the different type of task, because usually the drift diffusion model is applied to tasks where reaction times are smaller than in our case. Now, looking at the drift rate, which was the parameter we're most interested in, or more particularly the drift rate decomposition, what we see here is the posterior distribution of the population level effects of the on the top of the stimulus utility effect on the drift rate. Then in the middle, the stimulus originality effect on the drift rate, and the third one is the drift rate intercept. And we can see that the originality effect is pretty much larger than the utility effect. And in study 2, this was, so we again wanted to see whether we find the same pattern, and actually, so the plots do look pretty similar. And we also tried to quantify the evidence for the positive effect of originality and utility on the drift rate. And it was there was much more evidence for the originality effect and less so for the utility effect. And we also quantified the evidence for the hypothesis that the originality effect is greater than the utility effect on the drift rate, and that rather than the other way around, and that was also the case. So what this basically means is that originality is valued a lot on average across participants when they judge creativity, and same for utility. But again, also that people seem to value originality more than utility when completing the task. Now, we also discovered pretty big individual differences in the effects of originality and utility on the drift rate. Here you see the individual estimates in increasing order. So for each participant, there is one dot and the corresponding credible interval. And on the left, there are the originality effects. And on the right, we have the utility effects. And what we see is that for the individual originality effects, many people seem to have a positive effect. And only, a couple also have an effect around 0. And there are even a few who have a posterior mean below 0. However, their credible intervals still includes 0. And on the right, we have this very similar pattern for utility. Quite a few people with a clearly positive effect, a few, actually most with an effect around 0, and then a couple, I think 4 or 5 with a posterior mean and credible interval below 0. And so what this means is that there are people appear to differ in the extent to which they value originality and utility when they judge creativity. And in study 2, we found a very, very similar pattern. And we also tested a couple hypotheses. For example, we wanted to quantify the evidence for the hypothesis that everybody has a positive effect, which was not supported. So not everybody has a positive originality effect. Not everybody seems to value originality. And same for utility. Also, not everybody has a positive utility effect. And this almost implies qualitative individual differences, so that some people have a positive effect, some have a negative effect. And this individual variation also manifests itself in a negative correlation across the individual effects, meaning the more people took originality into account when evaluating creativity, the less they took utility into account, and vice versa. And so here on the left, you see the joint posterior distribution of the originality and utility effects, and gray, so darker areas indicate greater density. And on the right, you see the extracted individual individual estimates, posterior means, so here each dot represents a participant. And then for study 2, we tested this hypothesis, and we again found the negative correlation, but it was weaker than in study 1. As a plausibility check for our rationale behind the drift rate and this drift rate decomposition, we also examined associations with between the individual effects of originality and utility on the drift rate and the explicit self-reported ratings, like how important they thought those were for creativity. And what we found was that the more people seem to value originality, the more they also indicated that explicitly. And same for utility, the more they implicitly seem to value utility according to or based on the drift rate effect, the utility effect on the drift rate, the more they also said yes, the more they rated utility as important for creativity. So this implicit measure that we thought we had, so this implicit measure that we thought we had with our individual effects of stimulus, originality, and utility on the drift rate corresponded with the self-reported ratings by the participants. We also explored how creative ability, as assessed by the alternative uses task, corresponded with creativity evaluation, our task. And here we found that the more people valued originality, the more original responses they produced in the AUT task. And also the less useful responses. However, we only found that in study 2, so this was an inconsistent finding across studies. In study 1, there was not really an association, but in study 2, there was one. And with regard to the utility effects, here we also found in study 2, but not in study 1, that the more people appear to value utility when evaluating creativity, the more useful responses they produced on average on the AUT. And the less original responses they produced. So again, the reverse. As a robustness check, we also conducted some additional analyses. One potential caveat is that the contest stimuli are negatively correlated. So with regard to their originality and utility. So the more original a stimulus is considered, like objectively considered in the task, the less useful it is. And so one could think, or it seems possible that the correlation that we found across individual effects could actually be simply due to this inherent correlation in the stimuli. And that's why we did this additional analysis where we excluded those items that most strongly contributed to the negative correlation in the task stimuli. And so we re-estimated the drift diffusion model on this non-correlated subset of the stimuli. And what we found was that in study 1, the correlation remained substantial, so it wasn't really affected by this uncorrelated subset of stimuli, but not in study 2. And so this kind of suggests that, in study 1, it's just more robust than in study 2. And in study 2, the correlation could also be due to that correlation in the task stimuli. And another additional analysis that we did to assess the robustness of our findings was probit model analysis. Here, the goal was to examine whether we would arrive at the same substantive conclusions using a much less computationally expensive method. So that estimating the DDM takes a lot of time, and yes, a complicated model. And so we wanted to see whether using a different type of analysis, to what extent can we reproduce our conclusions. And that actually worked well. So with the probit model analysis, we did find the same things, that the originality effect was greater than the utility effect, and there was a strong negative correlation, and huge individual differences in the extent to which people value originality and utility when judging creativity. And here, the most important difference in comparison to the drift diffusion model is that the probit model analysis does not take response times into account, right? So it only takes the decisions, the binary response variable, into account. So looking at what we have found across the 2 studies, I would like to now discuss each of the main findings and go a bit more in detail. Overall, people seem to value originality more than utility. And this is in line with previous research. So this is nothing new. But now it would be interesting to explore whether these findings also generalize to other types or other situations of creativity assessment. For example, in the real world, if you think of climate change, like problems that need creative solutions, would utility also be so much less valued than originality? So that's something that future research could look into, to see how these findings generalize to other settings of creativity needs to be judged. And furthermore, future research could also extend the context by including other potential dimensions of creativity, so that it also has been argued that originality and utility is not enough, that there are other dimensions of creativity, or that they should even be replaced. So there is a debate about that. And for example, it would be interesting to extend the context using by surprise, so that and we could then examine the implicit values of those additional dimensions, such as surprise, when people judge creativity. Now, we also found these huge individual differences in how much people seem to value or take into account originality and utility in the contask. And this is actually quite remarkable, given that we actually had a quite homogeneous sample. This was our first year psychology students. And so, it's just interesting, I think, that there are so huge quantitative and qualitative individual differences. And it would be interesting to see how other samples from completely different populations, like how they would score on the task, and whether they also show such huge individual variation. And also the fact that we found that the more individuals appear to value originality and utility, that the more they also explicitly indicated that. That seems to suggest that the contask kind of addresses those implicit conceptions of what creativity means. And so implicit values might actually also determine what ideas we produce and select in the alternative uses task. And so since we found that the more original solutions people produce, the more they, in the AUT task, the more they appear to value originality, and also same for utility. This kind of suggests that this taps into this implicit, in these implicit conceptions, and that this kind of influences the performance on the AUT. But of course, we can't really say anything about causality. But seems interesting, and it's a hypothesis. But then again, it's important to point out that we had inconsistent findings here across studies. So I think it makes sense to explore that more in depth in future research. Now, from a methodological point of view, there are also a couple of points I would like to address. So this was a very novel application of the drift diffusion model. As far as we know, it's the first time that such a model has been applied to the evaluation phase of divergent thinking, and this, it worked pretty well. So we had a good model performance, but it's just also interesting to point out that it's unusual in the sense that usually the model is applied to tasks where there is a clear right or wrong, so accuracy, and we didn't have that. So we had this implicit yes, creative, or no, not creative. So that's actually the main difference, and that's also why it's so unusual, I think. So it's nice that it worked out well. On the other hand, the probit model analysis might suggest that the model is a bit overly complex, since for the questions, the substantive questions that we had, since the conclusions that we draw could also be were similar with the probit model analysis. And what this suggests also is that that response times just didn't play that much of a role here. That they at least were mainly driven, that drifted was mainly influenced by the decisions and less so by the response times. And to explore that more in depth, it would be interesting to use different instructions, or to vary them regarding response time. So for example, we could instruct participants or constrain them to say, okay, you have to answer within 3 seconds, or we could just really stress them so that they are under time pressure and see whether we still find the same results, or also how that would affect the drift rate and the results that we found in this study. And then lastly, overall, the tendency to respond more slowly to original and useful ideas, that could maybe be because of this negative correlation that we found between the originality and the utility effects on the drift rate. Because participants seem to balance the two dimensions, originality and utility. And it could be that that's why for stimuli that were highly original and highly useful, that they responded more slowly, because they were mentally balancing the dimensions. Now, in terms of practical implications, because there was such a huge extent of individual variation, I think it's important to take into account for practitioners and researchers that people differ in what they consider creative. So it's important for AUT instructions, for example, that it is made clear that participants are rated both on originality and utility, because if they implicitly do not take into account either of the dimensions, then they will not score well. Whereas if they knew what was expected of them, then they would potentially perform better in the task. So in conclusion, there were huge individual differences in our studies in the extent to which people value originality and utility when judging the creativity of an idea. And the drift diffusion model can be used to study those implicit conceptions of what creativity means. However, the role of response times is not clear yet, and future research should look into this and maybe vary response times instructions and to better understand what's going on there. So that was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this excellent talk. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. As I told you, we admire your work. So thank you very much for this great opportunity. And to all the people that are listening to us, because we have several people connected in the transmission, there's a form there in the chat that you can fill in order to ask your questions. In the meantime, I would like to ask you, I have a paper here with a lot of questions. So I will start myself. First, thank you again for this opportunity. And maybe some of them are naive questions, but I would like to clarify some stuff. The first thing that I want to know, and it's a general question, and maybe this could make me to set up a little bit more about the other ones, the implication and applications for this kind of work.
Yes. Oh.
Yes. In the application, because I have a question here. Well, I don't know if in Europe or in the US happens something like that. But when you are applying for a grant, for example, and one of the phrases sometimes says that this not need to be something creative. And I don't know, but here something weird happens when the people said that something creative need to be useful. It has to be some utility in this kind of sense. But what can we see for this application of your work in order to see how do you determine the best selection of the decision making that the people that are going to give the grant uses in order to see if this is originality or this is have some utility when they refer to the term that need to be useful. Something created needs to be useful.
Interesting question. So I think so. In terms of some, not sure. Maybe correct me if I misunderstood you here. But so I think in terms of when we think of what do the grant reviewers, what will they consider creative? So in that sense, I think not much. These findings would imply that not much utility is required, right? Because the utility effect was much smaller for something to be considered creative. But then again, I would be very, very careful with making these implications, because we cannot really, we must keep in mind that this is mainly applied to this alternative users task. And as I mentioned, like for other settings where creativity judgments are needed, it would actually be really interesting to explore that, like in this specific setting of evaluating grant ideas, grant proposals, what's considered creative and whether those dimensions are even useful, right? So originality and utility, or whether people actually have a different thing in mind. But as you said, they do mention utility. So, but it's interesting. I think one implication is also that since people vary so much on what, like how important they think utility is, you can't really make a prediction about what will be considered useful enough. I mean, I guess it depends on the grant reviewer. And then again, we had a student sample. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much. I have a question here from the audience, and then I can move to another one that I have. So this is a question from Valeria, and she asks, in this kind of studies, do you have apply this kind of studies in a different population, maybe in kids or adolescents? How do you do this kind of work, and how can you apply for different populations?
Great question. Actually, my collaborator, Claire Stevenson, she also did a study with where she looked at a developmental trend also. So she does research where she also looks at how these things differ between adolescents and adults. And so basically, but the setup is very similar. So you just use the same task for the different populations. But then again, not much has been done here yet. But yeah, so interesting. That's an interesting avenue also to look at whether kids, for example, value originality more or less than adults. I think that's also what Claire found. So that originality, just utility becomes more important.
Okay, perfect. We have a comment here from Paola that she thanks you a lot for your great talk. It's very interesting and motivate her to continue pursuing a path in the research. So she sends you congratulations. I have another question about maybe it's kind of a different path, but what are the implications to teaching creativity? We have, I remember, if not correctly, we have a course here in the program in our university that is about creativity. So what implications does your work have in order to teach in the teaching part of creativity?
I think one area that this research taps into is how we define creativity and what should be considered creativity. And there is, as I mentioned, I think in the talk, there are debates on the definition of creativity, like the standard definition of creativity that it's just originality and utility is questioned, and there is a debate around that. So I think one implication is also that since there are such huge individual differences, even among quite homogeneous samples such as students and as well as researchers, I think that could be an interesting thing to look at also in a course, to discuss what does creativity even mean, and how can we best approach. And I mean, there are different approaches to study that, to study what's considered creative, and this is one of them. And I think there are other very useful ones, and to compare those and see what seems most promising. I think that's very interesting.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Another question that I have, that I was thinking, maybe you mentioned it, how the people are defining utility and originality, because I don't know if this was studied in your research, but maybe I was thinking the people that have some definition of originality or utility, that it makes them to decide that is better the originality or utility, some kind of bias in their definition of these terms. So I don't know if you dig into it.
Yeah. So what we did when we explicitly asked them to rate the originality and utility, we also asked them to rate innovativeness and appropriateness. So, and those were kind of synonyms. So we tried to. So I think that the idea behind that was also that in case somebody doesn't really understand what original means, maybe then innovativeness taps more into that, and then we computed a sum score to add those together, so innovativeness and originality and appropriateness and utility. But yeah, I definitely think that that's something to consider, like what people actually understand under, whether they truly understand it as novel and useful. But then also, I think it's ratings, but it's a good question. I mean, you never really know what people truly understand under a certain term.
And well, for me, a final question. Sorry, I have a lot. I can send you by email. But a final question. In terms of science, how can the people judge from this that one scientific idea is something original or something useful or with utility? Because sometimes this is a debate in the science that says this science is not useful, it doesn't serve a purpose, but it's original. And the other side, no, we have something that is useful, but it's not an original idea. Can this be applied in this context? I ask you because sometimes science is judged in that way, that something is original or something has utility. So what can we do with this?
So do you mean in terms of coming up with own research questions?
Yes, for example.
So I think, I mean, the optimum would be to find something original and useful. I think that's the best bet.
Yeah.
But I mean, apparently utility, according to these studies, utility seems less important. But then again, I think it really depends on the setting where you apply it. So in research, I think it's really important that a research idea is also useful and not just great original and new, but not really applicable to anything, or doesn't really serve any purpose. I don't know. Do you know what I mean, or do you have different thoughts?
No, I think I agree with you. Perfect. I have a comment here from Moramai that she says, "Good morning. Thank you very much for this magnificent talk. It's very interesting about the relation that we do with respect to utility and the conception of creativity." And she thanks you very much for this. And Michelle, I have a final question, more like a methodological kind of one. Mm-hmm. What different approaches you can apply for this setup? You use this Bayesian approach, but what other approaches are for researching about this?
You mean for creativity research?
Yes. In the terms of this area of modeling.
I think so. So another accumulator model that you could potentially apply here is the LBA model. You know it?
Linear ballistic.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. So I think that one would be a very similar approach. Might work well as two. We haven't tried it, but I think you could also do, I think, like something like latent class analyses, or I mean, even also simple methods. I mean, the probit model analysis that we did was much less computationally expensive, right? So the DDM really is the most no, I don't know whether it's the most computationally expensive, but it took a long time to run each time because it was a huge amount of data. And other, I think there are so many, I guess there are many ways to address the same questions, that it's also interesting to see how whether we arrive at the same conclusions, how robust they are.
Okay, perfect. And I have a question from Octavio. Also, he asking, does creativity can develop or train it? And if there is any type of research, or if you consider something like train it for a creativity.
I'm not sure, actually. I'm pretty sure, I guess my guess would be that there is research on it, that you can train it and become more better at the task. But then I think it's also, again, important to keep in mind that, but it's questionable whether that then also applies to creativity in real life. So if you really, whether you were really good at coming up with solution, if you train yourself in the AUT task, I'm not sure whether that can then transfer to other types of creativity, where creativity is needed. But it's definitely something that's interesting to look into. I guess I don't know it, but I think there would be, my guess is that there is research on it, but I unfortunately don't know it.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. I have a final question from Carolina. She said that I wanted to mention that I heard that there is no creativity at all. There are just improves or what is already exists. But I want you already, but is what you already mentioned. There is a lot of opinion about the topic. Such an interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, there is a lot of. So is this a particular study, or is this just or is this something that was mentioned somewhere, that there is no creativity?
I think it's a comment like she heard. Maybe I can ask Carolina to dig for this paper or this research, and maybe we can comment to you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, there's so much debate going on about these things, but that there is no creativity at all, I find hard to believe.
Yeah.
Because we have, I mean, innovations, and so many innovations, and new things that help us thrive as a society from time to time. So I think maybe that you could use a different term for that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you. So, Michelle, we are very close to the end. So let me give just a little bit announce for the people that are listening to us. At the end, we are going to close the transmission. I am going to stay for a couple of minutes only with Michelle in the session, only to thank her and say goodbye to her. So we are very close to the end. So I have a question, final question in the chat that is from, let me see the name, sorry, from Alejandro. Is there any proof or studies that show creativity and mathematical logic are bounded or linked?
Mathematical logic, not that I'm aware of, but I might as well just not know them, unfortunately. If I come across one, I will send it to you and you can forward it to Alejandro, if that's okay.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. And for the last part of the session, I would like to mention something that is very important for us. And I want to thank you again, Michelle. We talked the last week that we have this group that is very important for us to visualize the research and the work that the female scientists, mostly here in the mathematical psychology and cognitive modeling, are doing. And I thank you very much, Michelle. And also I want to mention also to Dr. Julia that are here with us in the meet today, that is very important for us in the group to visualize this work that you are doing. So we are very honored to have you today here. As I mentioned, you have all our support, all our admiration in all your work. So thank you very much, Michelle. And I would like to ask you for the final question that I would ask for my speakers in the seminar is, we have this pandemic going on in the world, and here in Mexico, in one of the things that we have is very difficult to find data and to do some analysis and goes for research. But we are trying to stay motivated in this field, in this area. So I'd like to ask you for this final reflection from your point of view, from your experience, about doing research in the pandemic. How can we stay motivated? And that you can tell us briefly, what is the background that our students need to develop in order to start doing research in this kind of area? Please, Michelle.
Oh, okay. Wow. So I think so staying motivated, the first part of your question of staying motivated during the pandemic, I think it really helps to keep in touch with other students, with professors, with teachers, wherever possible. And I think this seminar is a great opportunity for that. It's actually it's perfect for being able to share your work and discuss your ideas and questions you may have about any topics during your studies. I think that's very valuable. And also, I mean, it's so great that I can be in Switzerland and talk to you guys in Mexico. I think that's just amazing. So I think we can also exploit these possibilities and try to make the best out of this situation. So I think, so to sum up, I think staying in touch with everyone is really what helps. And about doing research, I think just pursuing what you find interesting and finding peers who are also interested in the same topic and asking a lot of questions and being critical and reading. I don't know. And that's not really a structured answer, but that's what comes to mind. And just really doing what interests you and pursuing that.
Perfect, Michelle. Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for this great opportunity, Michelle. I have a last question that I would like to ask very quickly from Eli Ruggiero in the chat. I'm a student of Master in Mathematics Education, and I would like to ask you about creativity is not currently part of the assessment criteria in mathematics, for example. How do you think this type of study can help us understand the importance of divergent thinking with the aim of achieving more comprehensive assessment of a student's ability?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure whether I would advocate for this task, like the this task, to be used. But I think, there are also other tasks that try to assess creative ability. So I think if it's used for assessment, then I think there should be like maybe hopefully at best a diverse range of tasks, but also like that's not really my area of expertise, unfortunately, so that I can't really say anything about that. But I guess it's definitely more important for some subjects than for others. I think so. It doesn't surprise me that it's not part of every assessment for every subject at the university. But I don't know whether that now answers the question.
No, thank you very much, Michelle. Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Michelle. And Valeria says, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Alejandro, thank you very much. And thank you again, Michelle, for this great opportunity.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be here, and it's a great, also thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you and for all your questions. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, of course. And thank you so much.
And Michelle, well, we want to thank to the Vicerrectoría de Investigación y Estudios de Posgrado, the Office Research, the General Office of Research here in the university, for all the support, to the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ignacio Martinez Laguna, to Yadira and Rogelio for this opportunity. And I think we are closing the transmission, but just let me a couple of minutes, only to say goodbye. Also, if Dr. Julia can wait us a little bit more, but thank you very much. And thank you, Michelle. I hope you have a good time with us.
Thanks, I did. Thanks so much for everyone. And bye.
Just wait me a minute just to ask Rogelio and Yadira.